Welcome to Straight to the Point. I'm your host, Representative Joe Diorsi. In a world of long-windedness, I'm here to deliver you the Capitol News in 10 minutes or less. So, let's get straight to the point. So this is the Straight to the Point podcast. I'm Representative Joe Diorsi, and I have a special guest phoning in from D.C. today. It's Chief Economist for ALEC, Jonathan Williams. He is the author of Rich States, Poor States, which we'll have a look at today. And we're going to talk everything economy, nationally and on a state level. Jonathan, thanks for joining.
Well, thanks for having me, Representative, and greetings from the land of make-believe down here in Washington, D.C.
Well, it seems like that in the capital of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, that we're in a make-believe land as well sometimes, and we'll get into that in an economic sense here. But first, Jonathan, nationally, the economy in every poll or survey that I've read as we head into election season is front of mind for many people. It seems that the social issues of yesterday have kind of faded and inflation has taken center stage. I'll share an important stat about Pennsylvania. 60% of Pennsylvanians are living paycheck to paycheck. Inflation is hitting the gas pump, of course, the grocery store, and elsewhere. Is there any light at the end of the tunnel as we head into the fall with the economy?
Well, it's a very good question. It's one that is continually at the top of people's minds, and for good reason, because this experiment that we've seen nationally with so-called Bidenomics has been a complete abject failure for hardworking taxpayers across the country, whether that is the continued pressure on tax rates and tax increases here in Washington, D.C. from the Biden administration and so-called progressives in Congress, and looking at the results of the huge amounts of trillions of dollars of new spending, of course, starting during the pandemic era, but those programs continuing on and even being expanded in many ways after the case. And where we're seeing right now, Representative, is a classic case of stagflation, right? This is what we've been warned about, and that is by the definition of lack of robust economic growth and high inflation. And when you look at these stubbornly high inflation numbers that, yes, they've come down since the highest of the pandemic, post-pandemic levels there when we were at 8 or 9%. But the overall level is still elevated and is still growing at a much faster pace. The Federal Reserve has always kept a 2% target. There's been some discussions recently to say, well, they should throw that out the window because it's too difficult to bring inflation down. Well, you know what? Representative, I'm kind of a Midwestern common sense guy myself from Michigan. This is economics 101. This isn't rocket surgery, as Art Laffer, my co-author of Rich States, Poor States, like to say. When you spend trillions of dollars more, you're going to have inflation because there's too many dollars chasing too few goods in the economy. And then you combine that other side with the stag part of stagflation, and that is a really anemic numbers of economic growth coming in. That latest GDP report coming in below 2% economic growth, which is not a healthy number whatsoever, especially with all of this government support. And one of my friends, Brian Westbury, a key economist, said that he thinks it's about 50% of that GDP number is coming from government spending and government transfer payments. And so the private economy is even doing much worse than the official statistics say. So Americans have good reason to be very concerned about where this economy is. And of course, the signs here in Washington under the current leadership is expect more of the same.
Yeah, so you mentioned Bidenomics. Sometimes, when I hear Biden's press secretary tout, job creation and growth with wages, I think to myself, this must be the hardest job in the country to be Joe Biden's press secretary because she literally lies for a living. But I wanted to ask you, they're touting this thing, Bidenomics, this system that is turning us south. Why is it deceptive to say that they're on the cutting edge of job creation and wages?
Well, it's always a great thing to judge a government program not by its intentions, but by its actual outcomes. And as we just talked about with the actual outcomes, I mean, whether they'd like to put a lipstick on a pig on this one way or the other, the bottom line is the economy is not growing the way it should be. Inflation, whether it's increase in prices or the phenomenon of shrinkflation that we've seen, where companies and producers are reducing the size and quantity of things in packages. I see these 1 liter liters of Coca-Cola instead of the old 2 liters that I remember. And there's lots of different ways that consumers are having their precious earnings and savings eaten up. The other thing that's really hard to ignore for the Biden administration is real wages. I mean, they talk about an increase of wages during the Biden administration, which technically is half true because nominal wages are going up. But when you take into consideration the cost of inflation, the real wages after inflation are actually down in many parts of this administration. Overall, workers are doing less well with this inflation phenomenon, even as wages on a nominal sense go up. And so it's very difficult. That's why they hire these people and pay them big money in Washington to be these spin doctors. But I think the American people can see through it, because at the end of the day, this is a kitchen table issue. When they sit down at that kitchen table and try to make ends meet on that monthly budget for their family, they know what's being talked about in Washington doesn't add up.
Yeah, so let's pivot to Pennsylvania. You mentioned the real wage figure. I read a report, and it might have been from you all, that from 2021 to 2022, Pennsylvania had a dip of 5.8%, which is among the greatest losers in the nation. You know, your typical losers like Illinois, New York, California were ahead of us, but not too many others. In your recent Rich States, Poor States State Economic Competitive Index, which you co-authored with Art Laffer and Stephen Moore, you have two kind of metrics. You have the economic outlook, with which Pennsylvania ranks 35th out of 50, and then the economic competitiveness outlook. And we're even worse there. We're at 42. When I look at Pennsylvania, I look at our geography, I look at our resources, our people, our colleges and universities, our opportunities. There is no way, Jonathan, that we should be ranking this low. I look at states around us like Ohio, West Virginia, and Virginia. They're way ahead of us. That's bad news. What are some key metrics that you look at, and why, from the surface level, from the panoramic view, is Pennsylvania doing so poorly?
Well, I totally agree with you. Pennsylvania should be booming because of all the natural resources and the great individuals and hardworking entrepreneurs around the state, and so many of the inherent advantages that the Commonwealth has. But when you look at the overall policy environment, and this is what we do at richstatespoorstates.org, you can follow along. We've put together this report for the last 17 years, and we've kept this consistent to be able to track not only where you are today at number 35, but where you've been in the past. And, you know, there's a mixed bag at 35. It's not as bad as Pennsylvania once was. Pennsylvania used to be a bottom 10 state in economic outlook. But also, to your point, Representative, it's not where it needs to be when it comes to competing, especially with neighboring states, where you've had states like Kentucky and West Virginia and Ohio, all three of those states in the 20s now in economic outlook, but in previous years had been in the 40s in some cases. So we're seeing really dramatic turnarounds in many of those states. And we can get into some of the reasons why if you'd like. But what we do to get these scores in Rich States, Poor States is we look at 15 different equally weighted policy factors that Art Laffer has really followed for 50 plus years now, because they're things that matter the most for economic growth state to state. And they're also things, and just as importantly, there's so many different ways to measure states today and lots of different indexes out there. But, you know, they're things that you in Harrisburg or state capitals, state lawmakers and capitals all across the country directly control. Things like tax rates and regulation and labor policy, whether a state's a right to work state or not, whether a state has a death tax or not. Those are key things, obviously, for Pennsylvania. The size of the government workforce relative to the overall private sector. Those are all things that we look at to measure states. And it's been an incredibly robust ranking system. As you mentioned, you know, we don't just look at that part of it. We actually look at, is the proof in the pudding or not? Once again, are these government programs and the policies in the state's portfolio, not just judging by the intentions, but judging by the outcomes? And when you look at Pennsylvania's score, or really when you look at any of the states that have too high of taxes and have over-regulation and have not followed really a free market, freedom-enhancing mindset for their state, you see persistent problems when it comes to the economic performance. And so this isn't unique to Pennsylvania. But when you look at state GDP growth, Pennsylvania lagging behind the nation there. Whether you look at employment growth, job growth over the last decade, Pennsylvania lagging. And then probably most concerning out of this is one of the key takeaways from Rich States, Poor States for nearly 20 years now. It's been people vote with their feet. Americans continue to vote with their pocketbook. They vote with their feet. They're leaving states with a lack of economic opportunity and high taxes, and they're going to states that value economic opportunity. And Pennsylvania's record there, as you know well, is one of the worst in the country in terms of overall net out-migration over the last 10 years of nearly 270,000 Pennsylvanians leaving on net, going to one of the other 49 states, which ranks 46 out of the 50 states. Only a few states in the country have seen more out-migration. So that's certainly some things to be concerned about. Well, it's not all bad news. You're not New York at 50th out of 50, or New Jersey or Illinois or some of the worst cases. There's a whole lot of room for improvement still.
Yeah, and that's hard for me as a legislator when we look at this domestic migration number over the last decade. Like you said, almost 270,000. We're losing out to West Virginia, Ohio, Tennessee. I believe our top receiver of imports is North Carolina. They're very business friendly, and of course, Florida and beyond. So we're in the lightning round here, Jonathan. I wanted to ask you about when I read your Rich States, Poor States assessment, there were two states that I would call poster children. You've got Utah and Arizona. What are they doing that we're not to attract people and to have a better climate for business and families? And then the second tier of that question, what role does education freedom have in that figure? Of course, I've been with House Bill 1904, which is a universal school choice bill in Pennsylvania. I can see the economic benefit to a system like that. So how would that potentially play into economic competitiveness?
Well, your efforts have been heroic, and I think that effort on education freedom is so completely linked to economic freedom when it comes to how will states end up growing their jobs and their population base in the years ahead. That is so important. And as you know well, in our ALEC Education Freedom Index, Pennsylvania currently gets an F in its overall system. And so it's a failing grade for Pennsylvania families and children. And thank God that you and so many of our ALEC leaders across the state, the Democrats and Republicans alike, are coming together to say something needs to change. And that's actually one of the key factors of Utah and Arizona, and how they've been cutting taxes and making sure they're a pro-free market state by reducing regulations, avoiding the death tax. They're both right-to-work states. They're both states, as you know well, that were part of this school choice revolution that's been sweeping the country for education freedom now, with 11 universal school choice states that provide that freedom to families. Arizona was second out of the gate after West Virginia in our ALEC leadership there that led that way back in 2021. And so those two states have a freedom agenda, whether it's economic freedom or education freedom. That's something to really emulate. We could probably do an entire show on those states. I was just out in Utah with the legislative leadership, and they are continuing to move the ball forward. They're not resting on their laurels. So it's an incredible case study at number 1 and number 3 in those cases.
Yeah, well, this is excellent stuff, Jonathan. Maybe we'll have you on for a part 2 if you're open to it. So thanks for joining.
Well, absolutely. Happy to do that. Continue the great work. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Jonathan Williams, he is co-author of Rich States, Poor States and chief economist for the American Legislative Exchange Council. This has been Straight to the Point. Visit repjod.com/mypodcasts.